Thunderstorms don't just wet the ground. Sometimes they wash the world of witnesses, blur the edges of what you think you know, and make ordinary nights feel like a trap door beneath your feet. Tonight you're going to hear 3 first-person accounts, true stories as told, where storms became the only thing louder than whatever was close enough to touch them. Each one starts like a photograph of a normal life, a runner on a 2-mile loop, a man fleeing a failing marriage to a lonely property, 2 friends driving home from a party. Each night, the rain starts as a backdrop and becomes a character, loud, indifferent, and somehow complicit. Listen close. The thunder will keep time. If you like true horror, subscribe and stick around. There are more of these on the way. I heard sobbing under my bedroom window. It was low, tremulous, the kind of sound that makes your skin have intention, like something inside you decided to stand up. I lived on the edge of suburbia. My 2-mile loop crossed a narrow stretch of woods and skirted a reservoir that nobody on my route ever mentioned. The place felt off in a quiet way. Old gravel roads, a handful of houses set back past mailboxes you could only see if you slowed to almost nothing. I ran at the same time every night, shoes, headphones, the same playlist, until it became white noise you could silence without thinking. That night the playlist cut to static halfway through a song, and the air smelled like wet dirt and copper before the rain hit full on. I remember the storm arriving, the way a visitor walks into your house and refuses to leave, loud and slamming doors into the hallway. The first fat drops hit the pavement with a sound like small palms. The sky opened with a whole vocabulary of noise, thunder that rolled and kept rolling, wind that tried to reorder the trees. My apartment is old, the windows rattle when it's angry. I was in bed, half awake, when the sobbing started, soft, then a line of speech that made me sit up. "Can you help me? I'm cold." It stopped me in a way that was not rational. The window above my bed looked out onto a narrow strip of yard, a chain-link fence, and beyond that, the dark lull of the reservoir. I lived alone. The noises outside usually came from neighbor dogs, the occasional car, or the crabbed complaints of the highway. This sound was too human, too close. I slipped my phone into my pocket, the small ritual that makes anyone feel possible, and wrapped a hoodie over my running shorts. The rain hit like marbles the moment I pushed the front door open. The streetlights ran like yellow knives through the wet air. I jogged, at first more curious than afraid. The sobbing stopped, the night swallowed it. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the deadbolt and call someone. Every other part of my body told me to go to whatever needed help, to not be the one who heard and ignored. Maybe it was the runner's stubbornness. Training your legs to ignore pain tends to make you answer small crises, or maybe it was simply the wrong kind of conscience. I took off down my usual route, hood up, shoulders hunched, rain working its way through fabric and skin. The woods came up fast, trees bowing in the wind, branches flailing like frantic hands. The path became a slick thread under my shoes. Thunder punctuated the night, like someone was clapping at the wrong tempo. Then I saw her. At the edge of the trees, near the fence that circles the reservoir, there was a woman wearing white. Even in that downpour, the dress looked pristine, wet, clinging and oddly bright against the black. She was facing the water, shoulders shaking from sobs I couldn't hear anymore. She was close enough to the fence to make me think she belonged there, but when I moved forward, she turned. She moved toward me with a speed that didn't match the rest of the storm. Not a stagger, not the slow half-run of someone collapsing, but a rush that seemed to push the rain away as if she carried a different weather system around her. My throat closed. I remember whispering, "Hey," like the sort of greeting you give a sleeping dog, hoping not to spook it. She stopped maybe 10 feet away, lifted her hand as if to ask for help, and then, without warning, veered sideways into the shadows of the trees. I followed because it's one of those choices you make and only realize the gravity of later. The woods swallowed her and the rain. For a terrible second, I thought she had melted into the mud. Then I heard her, above the tapping of rain, a sound like someone pressing their face against chain link and shoving their breath through it. She was on the other side of the fence, sitting on the wet ground, the barbed wire above her head glinting. She was pressed against the fence with both hands, and I could see her face, pale, water streaking down, eyes closed, and the shoulders of that white dress clinging to her frame. She didn't look at me when I stepped up. She put her forehead against the metal and laid there as if the fence were a pillow. For a moment, everything was so small. The patter of raindrops, the thump of my pulse, the small sounds of the world that tell you a thing is still ordinary. Then, very slowly, she unfastened her hands from the chain link and dove forward, into the reservoir. I can't describe whether it looked like courage or giving up. For a fraction of a second the world rearranged. A body slips under water, and the only thing left is the surface folding shut. I stood there and watched the ripples spread and then stop. The rain struck the reservoir like someone throwing thousands of coins into a drum. I called her name in a voice that cracked and wavered, but the storm took it. I sprinted to the water's edge, heart racing with a child's certainty that a loud noise will make wrong things stop. The fence was intact. The barbed wire arched above it. There was no damage, no clear place she could have squeezed through. The grass was flattened where she'd been sitting, but that could have been anything. I called the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tap the screen. Officers came, flashlights cutting cones through the rain. They checked the fence, walked the perimeter, said kind words about water safety and hypothermia and the risks of swimming in a reservoir at night during a storm. They dragged the shoreline for hours. Nothing. No personal effects, no footprints leading away in any direction the way you expect them to. The mud not telling the story I needed it to tell. The search turned up empty. They checked the cameras on nearby properties. They punched in queries on missing persons. They left with polite phrases that tasted like closure but meant little. For weeks after, I could hear raindrops differently. Rain became something you could fail or answer. I started sleeping with one light on, not because I wanted to chase away spirits, but because the dark felt too obliging. It allowed impossible things to breathe. At night I'd lie awake and think about her face when she pressed against that fence, the way her hands curved, the way she let go. I made myself walk the route in daylight, watching for any sign I'd missed. Fabric snagged on a wire, a shoe half buried in the mud. There was nothing. Sometimes I think about the chest thumping, how quickly a place you thought you knew can become a theater for someone else's drama. Other times I think about the rain and how it can hide footprints like an accomplice. People suggested rational things, a prank, an actress, someone drunk and disoriented, maybe. But the math didn't add up. The cold, the way she went into the water like she belonged there, the intact fence, the barbed wire untouched. The police suggested hypothermia, an accidental fall, even suicide. They ran their numbers and made the reports they needed to make. I kept going out on my runs because leaving a place to memory felt worse than walking through the risk of seeing it again. The nights are different now. Every patter of rain makes me pause. I learned the brutal way that storms do something to people. They magnify choices and shrink witnesses. They erase the small details that make events explainable, and the result is a kind of haunted arithmetic where subtraction rules. A month later, I heard steps on my back porch at 2 a.m, heavy enough to be someone's weight, light enough to be someone trying not to be heard. I pressed my ear to the window. The rain was a steady hiss. The footsteps stopped right under the bedroom window where the sobbing had begun. Whatever it was, human or not, moved on. The police came. They took notes. They left with the same polite words, the same inability to produce a conclusion that didn't leave me hollow. I never saw a woman in white again, not in person. On quiet nights, I sometimes catch myself humming the empty part of a song I was listening to that night, as if a melody can anchor memory to the shore. There are nights when the rain starts, and I just sit with a mug of coffee and watch the streetlights bleed into puddles, waiting for the pattern of my own footsteps to return to me. The thing that stays with me is not the body in the water. There was no body to be sure of, but the idea that someone could call out through the storm and have you answer. I answered. That, more than anything, is what haunts me. You cannot unhear a plea for help in the dark and then pretend you didn't. Sometimes the guilt isn't for what you didn't do, it's for what you were willing to risk. I left my running route for a while. When I came back, the reservoir felt like a place with a memory. The water, in daylight, looked ordinary and enormous enough to swallow mistakes of any size. I still go by sometimes, never alone, never late. Rain still makes me look up. Thunder still tightens my chest the way it always had. The night reshaped the fence for me. It became a line between what you might help and what you might lose sight of. I learned that storms are not just weather. They are a kind of witness that prefers to be silent. Between those two nights, rain became the chapter break of my life, an asterisk in my calendar. I began to hear storm sounds as a different language, the rhythm of rain, the way thunder's bass line could underscore something unlikely. I'd think of the woman in white and imagine explanations that ranged from the plausible to the impossible, but none fit neatly. The police had nothing. The neighborhood had no missing woman reports that matched, and conversation with neighbors turned into a morass of rumor and misremembering. That is the worst. The world wants a label, and when it can't have one, the story becomes a rumor you have to carry alone. When you wake to rain at night now, you will probably think of your own list of things you must watch for: a loose branch, a flooded street, a stupid driver ignoring warnings. You should also think of the small hardness that settles in your stomach when you hear human sounds in a storm. You will ask yourself what you would do if later a body is brought up, or if someone is found, or if a story hits the edge of news. You will have time to answer those questions in daylight. In the dark, you make different choices. You answer, and sometimes the world doesn't respond the way you expect. The second account started with the kind of life landmarks that feel boring to say out loud: divorce papers on a kitchen counter, a marriage that had slowed into polite toleration, a man who decided, for reasons that seemed both cowardly and necessary, to sleep out of the house for a night. He told me later that there was more to it than a single argument. There had been years of late nights, a fraying patience that shows in the way dishes are left in the sink in the distance when you ask a question and the answer is empty. He was middle-aged, sure of what he had been, and uncertain of what he had become. The property he chose was an old place on the edge of town. The roof was tin, ribs that rang like small bells in the wind. The windows were boarded, and the house had been vacant long enough to earn the kind of quiet that says the world has moved on. He arrived in the late afternoon, the sky a heavy sheet of grey. He told himself he was an adult with things to sort through, and one night away from the pressure of normal life was a kind of test. The metal roof sang as the storm set in, a metallic applause that kept him company when his own head would not. He sat in a folding chair in the living room with a flashlight and a beer, the kind of small rituals that make a temporary refuge feel like a choice. Rain came softer at first, then it settled into the building like steam. The house held the sound, wind conducted through the eaves, rain hitting the tin in a rhythm that seemed to count his heartbeats. The first sign, something was wrong, he said, was sound, glass shattering. It was not sudden like the report of a gun. It was a high, tinkling cascade, like someone had thrown a bag of marbles into the dark. He told himself it must be a tree, maybe a branch that hit a window. He picked up a rifle he kept for skeeters and varmints, not because he was expecting trouble, but because holding a heavy thing in your hands makes you feel less small. When he opened the boarded window that faced the back, shards of glass lay like teeth on the floor. The hole in the boards was far too small for a person. but the pattern of glass on the floor showed a disturbance on the inside too. A smear that did not belong, like a hand had tried to fit through and couldn't. He walked the house the way you examine bones you think are dead, slow, tentative. The boards creaked underfoot like old people complaining at the weight of your steps. He called out a few times, voice cracking over the noises of the storm. The storm answered with a chorus of rain and a sound below it, low and impossible to label. It wasn't footsteps exactly. It was a dragging, a softness like furniture being pulled a short distance and then left with an intent. He followed the sound to the bedroom he planned to sleep in. The mattress was undisturbed, the sheets tucked, but there was another sound there. Something heavy moved along the floorboards, then stopped, as if testing the room for life. He felt it like an animal's breath on his neck, only it wasn't air he could feel. It was ice, a cold that settled into his bones and settled in a room the way smoke settles. Wherever it came from, it carried an absence of warmth. He told me he crept, rifle held like a talisman, and peered out the window that faced the gravel road. The rain had taken down the distant visibility to a smear. In the corner of his flashlight's beam, the world had become a watercolor of shapes. Then he heard a sound that made him drop to his knees, the dragging of something heavy, slow, and methodical across the back porch. It stopped right under the window. He could see the silhouette of a person then, or something that wanted him to think it was a person, shoulders hunched, movement too deliberate to be wind. He remembered the tiny sound of someone setting something down on the porch, an object that registered in his mouth as familiar and wrong. He fired a shot into the air more as a warning than as an attempt to strike. The sound of thunder masked it, but whoever or whatever was there didn't flee. The dragging restarted, and the boards creaked as if someone tested every step. He grabbed the rifle and ran to the front door, because he thought to get the car and leave. The absurd human calculation that to flee is to be safe. As he reached the porch, his stomach turned to ice, and his hands moved like cold rubber. The door swung open, and the night slammed into him with the smell of wet grass and ozone. He stepped down, and the porch light flicked off, the kind of cheap bulb that dies with no ceremony. In a moment that felt both like cowardice and rational self-preservation, he fled. He did not wait for backup. He drove off into the storm the way one drives away from a bad dream, fast, hands tight on the wheel, eyes stinging with rain. He called the police from his phone, as if speaking into the small speaker would lend the situation a seriousness that would invite help. Officers went back, checked the property, walked the perimeter. They found a boarded window broken out in a way that made them frown, boards cut clean, as if with a tool. They found scuff marks along the floor, the kind you get when heavy things drag. They did not find a way a person could have left, unless they'd left over the roof or through water. No additional footprints led away in the soft ground. No evidence of someone sleeping on the site for any length of time beyond what the man reported. They took the man's statement, and the man felt both vindicated and small. He wondered later if they'd thought he was making a story out of his fear. He didn't sleep that night. He drove to a cheap motel and woke every hour waiting for a knock that never came. In the dull light of morning, the house looked less menacing and more like an old thing that had seen one too many storms. But the night had left a residue. He said the worst was the feeling of being watched in the daylight that followed, the uncanny sensation that something had learned the layout of his life and then stepped back to watch its effectiveness. People told him to sell the place, to rebuild fences, to install lights. He did none of those things immediately. He waited because waiting is what you do when you don't know what to repair first. Courage, sense, or belief. He thought for a while that the intruder might have been a squatter, someone using the storm for cover. That logic fit many things, but not everything. The boards had been expertly cut in a way that looked careless and deliberate at once. The dragging sound had not been the shuffle you expect from a person carrying boxes. The cold he felt behind him in that bedroom had not been just a lack of heat. It felt like a tension, like a measured, almost clinical evaluation that a human stranger rarely gives. He had handled guns his whole life enough to know the difference between fear and adrenaline. This was something else. Months later, he sometimes returns to the house to check, to stand in the doorway and let the rain trace out the eaves. He will not sleep there again. He told me he still looks at the window panes because he expects to find a smear, a handprint, a piece of someone else's life that will make sense. The police reports sit in a file, bureaucratic and neat. They say an unlawful entry was suspected, but nothing was ever charged. He remembers the sound of his own breath in the dark like a confession. He remembers the taste of metal at the back of his throat the night he left, and he carries that with a kind of muted shame. Like everything he did was both sensible and cowardly at once. Something about storms is that they give permission to things we would otherwise notice and name. Rain is an eraser and a curtain. It muffles shoes, hides footprints, and gives shadow places to hide. People used to tell stories about storms bringing the dead home, or thunder being the voice of gods. He doesn't believe in those things, and he believes in them after some nights. He thinks of the storm as a stage manager. It dims the lights, brings out the props, and waits while the actors figure out their lines. Sometimes the actors are human, sometimes they're not. Between the first and second stories, you can hear a kind of pattern, a drumbeat of thunder, the way wind rearranges the familiar into the uncanny. Rain does not create fear so much as focus it, like a magnifying glass on the small, already present anxieties we carry. If the first narrator had been a runner, alone and responsive to calls for help, the second narrator was a man whose life pivoted on choices he had been making for years. The storm didn't create his fear. It gave it a theater. The third story is the one that sticks to your teeth like metal. It's told by Jason, who was the designated driver for his friend Leo. They were coming back from a party, nothing cinematic, just a weekend thing, when the sky decided to perform. Rain hit in sheets so hard that headlights were useless. The wipers slapped and squealed, each pass a small mercy. The radio fuzzed with static between songs. Leo was his usual self at first, chatty, loud, poking fun at small things. But there was a nervy edge you only notice when you're trying to keep someone awake on a long drive. They were on a back road that cuts through open country when Leo told him he wanted to stop. Jason grumbled, who doesn't want to get home, but Leo insisted, saying he needed air. He wandered off into a field, just enough to disappear, then laughed and waved. Maybe it was 2 minutes, maybe 10. That's the thing about time in a storm. It's both elongated and sliced into useless bits. When Leo came back, he wasn't the same. He was wet, a little pale, and he moved like a person who had been looking for something and either not found it or found it and didn't like what it was. They drove on, quiet, the car a small island in a river of rain. Then, without anyone noticing, the tire hissed and sagged. Jason pulled to the side, and the smell of rubber hit him immediate and wrong. A glance around the shoulder of the road showed nothing but corn and the dark bodies of trees. He stepped out and saw the cause. A screwdriver jammed into the rubber like a fingernail. The blade had been forced through and the tire was bleeding air. They had no choice but to change it. It takes a minute in the rain for things to register as deliberate. At first, you think it's an accident, a nail, a shard. Then you see the tool, and your stomach flips to the wrong corner of your chest. They called the non-emergency line and reported it. The officer told them to wait where they were until help could arrive. They looked at each other, minds running towards possibilities, pranksters, kids with nothing better to do, someone with a grudge. Jason and Leo tried to laugh it off, their voices brittle. They pulled the screwdriver free, fingers numb with cold and with that slow cooking anger that comes from being messed with. The screwdriver slid out like a confession and left behind a wet, yawning hole. The flat was sudden. The air left the tire in a sullen whisper. They started changing the tire because the rain wasn't going to let them be. As they worked, Leo muttered about something he'd seen out in the field. A woman, he said, standing at the edge where the field met the tree line, white dress flapping wild in the wind. Jason said later that Leo sounded weirdly fascinated and guilty at once, like he had stumbled on someone private and had expected not to be seen. They moved faster, hands slick with oil and rain. The distant sound of a scream cut through everything, sharp, human, and split by the weather into something that made the hair along Jason's arms stand up. They couldn't tell where it came from. Behind them? Ahead, from deep in the corn? The scream was not long, but it held an urgency that the storm otherwise denied. For a moment, all the small, stupid decisions we'd all make under pressure crowded up in the dark. Leo wanted to drive toward where he'd seen the woman. Jason wanted to get to safety fast, to be off the shoulder and under roof. They argued, not loudly, but in that quiet way. People argue where both of you know the stakes and are too afraid to push the other into them. Eventually they left. They agreed, or maybe they didn't, but they drove. Two guys in a car, the sound of rain as a white noise protector, tires slashing through puddles. They called the police and reported a possible assault, the screwdriver found in the tire, the sighting in the field. Officers went to the area and checked the lines and the cornrows the way you inspect a bruise. They found no woman. They found no footprints leading away. They didn't find the screwdriver lying in the field either. It was only there when Jason pulled it out of the tire. They asked questions about where Leo had gone, about whether he had spoken to anyone. Leo's answers were evasive enough that Jason felt guilty. Did Leo disappear for a minute to go talk to someone? Was he the one who had been seen? There's a small, corrosive thing guilt does. It rewrites the ledger of your memory, turning a friend into someone you might accuse if only your night's courage allowed. In the weeks that followed, the two men replayed the night like tape loops, the flash of a white dress, the slice of a screwdriver, the scream that had no body to anchor it. They wondered if they'd fled a crime scene, if someone had been in danger and they'd let them down. That was the hardest part, this question that sits in your belly like a stone. What do you do when a storm offers you an ongoing test of courage and hears no answer? They worried that their leaving might have cost someone. They worried they might have driven away from the wrong place and towards safety that came at someone else's expense. When Jason and Leo told the story later, they tried to be honest about the stupid things they did, about not waiting for help, about not asking more questions. They told me they both felt small in the presence of such a big, indifferent weather pattern. The screwdriver became a talisman that showed up in memory a dozen times a day, small, hard, and absurd. It was a mundane object that carried with it a moral weight. They both slept as if sand had been poured into their ears. They didn't want to imagine who might be on the other side of a scream when the storm could hide the details. Police took their statements and told them there was nothing they could do without something more. A body, a witness with details, CCTV that actually showed something besides rain. Time is cruel in those situations. It erases the small signs that might have mattered. It blurs edges. The men checked their phones for texts to see if they'd missed a message that would explain everything. There was nothing. There was only the memory of a white dress and the press of rain and a screwdriver pulled from a tire like a confession. They both carry, since that night, a sense of being watched by a storm that knows when you are willing to run and when you are willing to stop. These three stories share a structural kinship, a normal night made strange by weather, a human cry or sign, a choice to approach or avoid, and an outcome that leaves an absence rather than an answer. The storm functions like a veil over the things we prefer not to see, Maybe they're coincidences. Maybe they're grim alignments of human missteps. Maybe there is something that prefers stormy nights, something that rearranges our assumptions and leaves us with small, unresolvable horrors. What unites them is not proof of anything supernatural. It's the way human instinct reacts to a crisis. Some run towards, some run away, and some freeze with the weight of guilt for not doing more. There is also the role of the police, the way institutions try to suture things back into normal, reports taken, perimeter searches, polite reassurances that mean less when your chest still tightens at the sound of thunder. In every case, an officer did what an officer could, and in every case the result was the same. No neat resolution, no paperwork that could replace the feeling of having been altered. These storms do not make motives. They give cover to motives. They mute witnesses. They make objects less trustworthy. A screwdriver is now a moral test. A fence is both barrier and bedside. A metal roof becomes a drum in the background of a potentially tragic play. What remains in each narrator is not a tidy story, but a texture, a way of inhabiting nights differently. The runner who answered the cry now sees rain as a summons. The divorced man who fled the property hears boards creak wherever silence lives. Jason and Leo will both think twice before leaving a place where a scream might mean someone needs help. How do you carry a night like that? The first narrator still runs, with a particular kind of wariness. He goes earlier now, when the sky is forgiving, and he never goes out without a plan. Someone who knows his route, a charged phone, a hesitation that keeps him from doing what he did before. The second narrator sold the property and moved on, but he still checks windows when his house is quiet. He doesn't tell people about the cold that followed him that night, because the word cold sounds small. The third pair sleep in different houses more often than they used to. They trade texts and make plans to meet in daylight. The screwdriver, when asked about, becomes a small, ridiculous and terrible reminder. They keep it as evidence and as penance. Maybe you read these stories and you see patterns of human failure, or you'd like to declare them coincidences. That's a defensible position. Or maybe you feel the same skin prick of unease they all share, that lightning can expose the places we don't want known, and rain will hide the things that might otherwise make sense. The lasting image for me, the thing that makes me pause when a storm rolls in, is small. A white dress clinging to a body at the edge of a reservoir, a man driving away with his hands clenched, a screwdriver pulled out of a tire and left damp in the rain. Each is ordinary, each becomes extraordinary by context. None offers an answer. That's the point. They don't resolve, they haunt. If you've had nights where weather rearranged your life, where a thunderclap made something familiar turn into a menace, or where a scream in the rain left you with a question you couldn't bear to solve, share it below. These are not calls to action that ask you to trespass or confront danger, only invitations to speak about what unsettles you, and to remember to keep each other safe when the sky itself seems to be acting strange. Storms will come. They will tell their own stories in the language of water and metal and thunder. Sometimes they are only weather. Sometimes they are the backdrop to something else. Sometimes you answer, sometimes you don't, and sometimes the only thing that remains is the memory of how small you felt when the sky got loud. Stay safe. Watch the storm. And if you have a story like these, true, small, and impossible, leave it in the comments so the next listener can hear and know they are not alone in the dark.